Let's do this. Welcome back to another episode of the Wellness Farmer podcast, where your health is my focus. I take what has become too complex and help you by simply focusing on where health is found inside of you. So, how do we empower ourselves to feel our best? With care of our spines, eating nutrient dense food grown on fertile soil without chemicals, adequate movement, and natural internal dialogue. On today's episode, episode 209, I bring you an interview with, which I haven't done for quite a while, but with a guy named John Vespasian. You might remember him because I've interviewed him before. Well, he just published a new book, and on today's episode, he talks all about it. What I really like about John is, and his books, is they are about history. So he takes history, things that have happened in the past, and he brings it into our day and takes those lessons from the past and make our lives just a little bit better today. It's really neat because I've always liked history, so he takes that history and puts it into ways we can use it to make our lives better today. And I mean, really, that's why we have a memory in history, is to not repeat what does not work and to repeat what does work. So check out his new book titled Undisrupted: How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. That's the title of his new book, Undisrupted. So check that out on Amazon, where you can find that book. You can also check out the show notes, and I'll have a link to it there also. So today is March 28th, 2019, and I am Ben Page, your host. And before we get into that interview, just a couple things. Remember, if you join my email list, you get a couple articles completely free, and the first couple of chapters of my book absolutely free. If you like what you read from the book, The 4 Pillars of Health, you can actually get a copy at Amazon.com or from my website, pastosverdethefarm.com. Also, don't forget that I'm on Instagram, so Ben Page DC. I'm on YouTube, Pastors Better This Farm, and on YouTube I have a new series about me and my urban mini garden, basically planter box garden, where I'm trying to grow some of my food, and you can see what's going on with that at my website, at YouTube, at Pastors Better This Farm. I think I'm actually on episode 14, so check that out. It's been going on for a little while now, and this latest episode, you'll see that I'm starting to eat some pretty nice hand-sized tomatoes. And most importantly, if you guys are getting value out of this podcast and you want to bring some of that back, go to my website, Pastors Better This Farm, and at the right, there's a Patreon button. You can click on that Patreon button. It takes you to a place where you can actually bring some of that value back towards me if you're getting value out of this podcast, which I hope you are. I hope you become a better you, not only healthy-wise, but just a better you overall by taking what you get from this podcast and putting it into your own lives. If you want to work one-on-one with me, get in contact with me from website pastosverdethefarm.com, and we'll talk about how I can help you, and we'll go from there. So if you want to work one-on-one with me, that's how you can do it. Go to my website, Pastors Better This Farm. So before I get into this interview, just another quote from the Daily Stoic. It's pretty neat, these things. This is actually from Epictetus again. It says, "For there are 2 rules to keep at the ready, that there's nothing good or bad outside my own reasoned choice, and that we shouldn't try to lead events, but to follow them." And that was said by Epictetus. And then Ryan Holiday continues to explain. He explains a little about it. He says, "Remember, each individual has a choice. You are always the one in control. The cause of irritation, or our notion that something is bad, that comes from us, from our labels or our expectations. Just as easily we can change those labels, we can change our entitlement and decide to accept and love what's happening around us." I thought that was pretty interesting. We are in control. And what seems to be irritating or something that's bad, we can actually change that and accept it and actually love what's happening around us. I mean, of course, there's extremes in both ways, but I would say for the majority of things that happen in life, we can actually love what's happening around us, learn from that, and become a better person. So today I have an interview with John. Like I said, it's been a while so I might be a little rusty on the whole interview. It's been a while since I interviewed, but I interview him about his new book, and go check it out. It's on Amazon. Again, it's called Undisrupted: How Highly Effective People Can Deal with Disruptions. And let's enjoy this episode. But before I go into that, take a screenshot, share it on Instagram, tagging me at BenPageDC, and I'll share it right back so we can grow and become just that much cooler of a community. All right, so let's get into this interview. Welcome back to another great episode of the Wellness Farmer Podcast. And it's been a while, but I am excited to bring back John Vespasian. He is an author and I have interviewed him a couple times about his books, and he's got a new book out. It's called Undisrupted: How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. That's the title. There's a lot of great stuff inside the book. Of course, we're going to be talking about some of it on today's episode. But before we get into the main portion of this podcast, I'm going to actually have John just kind of give a short who he is, because a lot of people probably have heard about him on this podcast, but all the newer listeners will let John explain who he is and how he got to where he is today. So, John, if you want to take a couple minutes first and just kind of introduce yourself, and then we'll get into the main part of this podcast.
Many thanks, Ben. What I've been doing now for the last 10 years is to write books about personal development from a very unusual perspective, because what I do is to go through dozens of biographies on events in history, present history, medieval history, ancient history, and try to draw principles that we can apply today in the 21st century in the areas of productivity, health, investment, personal success. And I present in my books, practical lessons using examples and real people. All the information that comes in my books is from real life. And what I try to do is to present it in a way that is very easy to implement and very realistic.
Perfect. And what I've seen over the last couple of years, it's been great information. It's helped probably me more than anybody else, just being able to read and learn what history is trying to teach us. And that's where we have history. That's where we have a memory. That's where we have things in the past to help us become better people. I mean, I've read in a book where it was saying we don't have a memory to remember memories. We have a memory to help us remember things that we shouldn't do. and that's where we have this history, and what you write down helps us to not do what we shouldn't do and do what we probably can do to help us live a more productive life. So this new book, it's called Undisrupted: How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. So what made you want to write this book?
Well, I got the idea from the book from reading a biography of a businessman. He lived in the 19th century in Russia. His name was Mamontov, Sava Mamontov. He's not well known outside Russia, but he was an extremely wealthy, very successful entrepreneur. He had railways, and he was building railways from Moscow to eastern Russia. He made a fortune, but at a certain point, he lost everything. I found the story very intriguing because Mamontov, when he was at the top of his power, he was in his mid-40s, he got the idea of expanding his business, and he started to invest in steel production. He wanted to make engines, locomotives, rails, and he thought it was very easy. He thought he could use his management abilities to expand his business, and it became a nightmare. He started to lose money, huge amounts of money in steel manufacturing. And then he made mistake after mistake. He started to panic. Instead of trying to stop the bleeding, actually to let his steel manufacturing go bankrupt, instead of doing that, he started to take the money from the railway that was very successful and use the money to pay for the losses in the steel manufacturing. It's one of the horrible strategies that I present in my book, that you should never do this kind of stuff. And it was not a problem if it was his own money, but the problem, he had shareholders and bondholders in the railway that was in the stock market. So they sue him. They filed criminal charges against Mamontov, and it was a very famous trial in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. And eventually he didn't go to jail, but he lost everything. He lost his houses. He lost all his friends. Nobody would talk to him. He was a very famous guy. He was a celebrity in Russia. People would just cross the street not to talk to Mamontov. He was completely ostracized. And he spent the last 13 years of his life in total misery. And I found this story very intriguing. How is it possible that such an intelligent, sophisticated man was a victim of disruptions? And then I started to investigate different biographies, different stories, to try to find the principles that we can use in life to avoid these kind of situations.
So it all started by reading about someone that totally messed up, and then you found stories in history where it actually kind of teaches us not to fall into what Sava Mamontov actually did. And so let's get into that. How can we prevent from disrupting our lives? I mean, so we're all going to have disruptions. I mean, it's normal. We're all going to have moments, I guess we can call them, some people might call them crises, but we're always going to have disruptions in life. How can we learn from your book to help us get through them and become even better on the other side? So how can we be like the people that you talk about in your book? And of course, we're going to use some of them as examples. But how can we start? How can we start off being more effective when those hard times come?
Well, the principle is very easy, and I just want to tell you a story of the principle. The principle is very easy. It's difficult to implement, but the principle is easy, and it's the following. In the 19th century, there was a lawyer. His name was Kowalewski. He became, because he was very fond of the theory of evolution, he became a paleontologist. He went to university and he started to teach about the evolution of animals. He came with a very fascinating theory about horses, because his idea was to prove scientifically that Darwin was right. And one of the intriguing questions in science in the 19th century is that nobody could understand, and scientists could not understand, how is it possible that small horses, and if you look at the fossils, the prehistoric remains of horses, they are very small. They are the size of a cat. How is it possible that these small horses became the big, fast, powerful animals that we know today? And in the 19th century, nobody could figure out a solution. People thought actually they were different species, that the small horses, the miniature horses, they were a different species. And only Kowalewski came with the answer. And the answer answers at the same time the question of disruption, because Kowalewski is the first person in history who figured out that these small horses became eventually very big, generation after generation, because they have to deal with disruptions. They have to deal with problems with the food supply, because the horses eventually they run out of leaves, because they used to eat leaves from the trees. But the trees started to grow because there was problems with the atmosphere. So eventually they have to change their food supply. So they started to go out of the woods to go into the prairie, and there they had to run because there are a lot of predators like big cats. So they have to run, and they started to become very fast. They started also to become bigger and bigger with each generation, because the horses that survive better to the disruptions are those that were a bit bigger. So in the end, Kowalewski came with a principle, and I find the principle super important, that when you are faced with a disruption, with adversity in any domain of activity, whether it's your health, money, a career, whatever it is, you have to react from your strongest asset, from your strongest skills. So the horses eventually started to run faster because they changed the way they run. At the beginning, they used to have 5 hooves, and in the end, they only use 1. So if you reduce if you reduce the surface of contact with the ground, they run faster. So they got bigger, they got faster. And this is exactly what you have to do when you have a disruption. You have to go to assets or to skills that you already have. The worst possible strategy when you're facing disruption is to improvise. This is the example I put at the beginning. I mean, Mamontov. Mamontov was a very, very expert railroad executive, but he started to improvise because he got into a business he didn't know anything about. And eventually he panicked. Instead of going back to his center of expertise, his railroad, he started to improvise, and he made a mess. And this is systematically, when you look at the stories of people who are victims of disruptions in any area, they always improvise. Instead of going back to the basics, which is what you have to do, always go back to something you know, to places you know, to skills you know, to a profession you know. This is the way to build your strength. If you improvise, you perish.
Wow, and so you're talking about big scale. I want to give you an example of that just happening like 5 minutes ago. When I opened up Skype, I haven't done an interview for a little while. And when I opened up Skype, I didn't see the record button active. So I was like, what's going on here? How am I supposed to record this? So what I improvised, and I hurried up and went to the website, and I downloaded the newest version, which is an unpaid version, and I installed it. Now it's saying I have to buy the version now. And if I would have just went back to my basics, if I would have just called you and saw that the record button goes active once I call you, I wouldn't have to go through all this. Now I'm going to have to probably send an email to the company that I bought the recorder from and see how if we can fix this out. But that is so funny. Even on the smallest things, if we just go back to the basics, it makes life so much more simple and so much more easier. And this just happened to me. I joke, 5-10 minutes ago, right before we started recording this. So that is just so crazy how we were talking about that, and it just happened to me of course, in a very small way, but it just happened to me. And I should have just went back, and I should have just waited till I called you, and everything would have worked out perfectly fine. But I kind of, like you said, I kind of panicked and like, oh, whoa, it's not working. What do I do? So I went and did something that I probably shouldn't have done, and now it's going to take me some time and some emails to get this whole thing worked out. Crazy how that works out. And just like the big, I mean, even in the small situations, it'll help us maybe not have to go through a little bit of pain instead of when you do make a big mistake, we have to go through a lot more pain. But very interesting, and I'm very excited to jump into this because not only, so you're there in the book, you talk about how wealth, you talk about how to run projects smoothly, and some of the things I would like to talk about, and how to stay positive when you're trying to overcome these disruptions. And let's get into that one first. So you have an example in your book about how to stay positive when you're actually trying to overcome, or you're overcoming these disruptions or these times that are very difficult in your life. And what did you find in history that kind of helps us stay positive when we're going through these tough times?
Yeah, there's a formula that always works. And I got the idea from a guitar player. He was a very famous guitar player in the 1940s, 50s. His name was Django Reinhardt. He was Belgian. He also went to the United States for a while. And Reinhardt, he had an accident. He was a gypsy. He was living in one of these cars that they travel from city to city. And they didn't have electricity at that time in the 1930s. They used candles. So during the night, nobody knows what happens, but one of the candles was overturned, and the car who was traveling, he got fire. So he got heavily burned, and he lost mobility in one of his fingers. And this was very, very negative for a guitar player because you cannot really play guitar with 4 fingers. So the question is, what do you do in these kind of situations? And Reinhardt found a solution. I found the solution super interesting because he created a principle. And Reinhardt did the following. He looked around to say, okay, what can I do? I mean, I want to be a musician because he was actually very talented. It was for him the only way to make money, because for gypsies without education, he was moving from city to city. He didn't have a home. The only way forward was to be a guitar player. So he figured out what he could do, and he said, "Okay, has anybody in history been able to play guitar with 4 fingers?" And the answer was no. Or could I play another instrument with only 4 fingers? And the answer was also no. I mean, there was nothing he could do. But he raised the right question and say, how could actually find a way to do it, even if you have to change the parameters? So he figured out very cleverly that if he played faster, 20%, 25% faster with one hand, eventually he could make it up. He could play more or less normally, just faster. So he trained and trained and trained. He spent 6 months training with 4 fingers, and eventually he was able to play the guitar with 4 fingers on his left hand, and he played super fast. So when you hear recordings from Reinhardt, it looks like magic, sounds like magic, because he was super fast, he played super well. But the answer when you're facing this kind of situation is always the same. You have to see who has solved similar problems in the past. They don't have to be exactly the same problem. So if you are sick, sometimes you will not find exactly the same example, because you might have a rare sickness. But you can find examples of people who are in the same range of problems. And this is what Reinhardt did. He figured out that there are other people playing a violin. People sometimes change the design of the instrument to be able to accommodate their special situation. So he figured out, if I do it faster, I can just play guitar. And it's the same principle in every situation. If you're facing a financial problem, you're facing a career problem, try to do some research and look for stories, real stories, of course, of people who have solved more or less the same problem. It has to be in the same range. It doesn't have to be precisely the same. Could be in another century, could be in another profession, could be in another context, another background. But if you find an example that shows you what other people have done, like Reinhardt did, eventually you find the solution, because you feel this inspiration to be positive in the sense of rational positive, rational expectation. Because Reinhardt was not crazy. He realized that there has to be a solution. You just have to find it. And I would say that 99.9% of all problems are already solved by someone else. You just have to see how they actually took action. And the principle always works. There is very, very rare that you will have to face a problem that is original. In a way, human experience always repeats itself in history. You just have to make a little effort to investigate, to find an example, someone who has solved similar problems, and then you will feel very optimistic, because you know that if you do what, you will get the result you are looking for.
Interesting. And to actually get to that point, so do this, and that, you also talk about in your book how you can actually run that project smoothly. So you kind of find out, and you kind of have some this might work out. I might be able to get out of this funk. And then how do you go about doing it? How do you go about going through this disruption and coming out on the other side better than you were? Or how do we get undisrupted? And you also talk about that.
Yeah, this is a story from the Middle Ages. I look at a very intriguing story about projects that go through enormous disruptions. And the biggest disruptions I found were in the Middle Ages. If you look at the cathedrals in Europe, the Gothic cathedrals, they are super, super tall, super beautiful. They're still standing after 7 centuries, 8 centuries. They're still standing. And they were built by very poor people and very small people. People in the Middle Ages, they were 3 feet tall. They were quite small. This was the average height. And they built these amazing cathedrals. And they have to deal with amazing context. I mean, you have to realize the weather was very cold. You could not work during the winter. It was -10 everywhere in Europe, -5, -10 the whole winter. So it was very difficult to work outside. You have to deal with problems of logistics because it was very difficult to transport hundreds and hundreds of stones to build the cathedral. So you have to find a solution. They also have to find a solution for the technological problems, because when they went from building small churches, typical Roman churches from the 6th century, to build huge cathedrals. I mean, we are talking these Gothic cathedrals, even today in the 21st century, they are not easy to build. There's very, very high ceiling. They have these very thin walls. They have these huge windows. And they found solutions for that. And it was one guy, his name was Suger. He was an abbot in Saint-Denis, very close to Paris. He put together a system for managing projects without disruptions. And before Suger, there were a lot of plans to build cathedrals, but nobody was able actually to do it because the challenges were just too big. And Suger came up with a very interesting principle for running projects. And I'm going to tell you what it is, because it's something you can use, I think, in the 21st century. You can use the same principle to make sure that your life runs with very few disruptions. So Suger, when he found all these problems, he made a list and said, okay, I have a problem with logistics. I have a problem with scaffolding, because I have to build huge scaffolds for these small people. They have to really climb 100 meters above ground to be able to work on the window. So he has to solve all these problems. And eventually, he found an answer in the principle of working smoothly and continuously. And in order to avoid, for instance, the winter, because the winter was the biggest problem, that if you hire, for a cathedral, if you hire 300 people, they can only work from May until September, because then it got too cold. So Suger said, if I can solve the problem of the weather, which is a huge disruption, then I can solve all the other problems. So Suger, what he did is to figure out how to spread the task he has to do so that people could work smoothly and continuously the whole year. So instead of having these typical peaks and valleys that you have in projects, and then you have a lot of delays and a lot of disruption, what Suger did was to organize the work to minimize any kind of deviation. So he built houses for the workers. He organized the work so that during the summer, they would be able to place the stones on the cathedral and to build the walls. And during the winter, they work inside in the houses, cutting the stones. So he could just, they hire these masons, and they spend the whole winter cutting the stones to the right size. And during the summer, they just put them together so they could work smoothly. And in this way, he was able to surmount all the disruptions, because he could always work with the same level of manpower, with the same level of funding, year after year after year. And in 10 years, which is very, very short, in 10 years, he finished the first cathedral, the first Gothic cathedral in France. It was hugely successful. And then in the next 30 years, people copied exactly the same model all around Europe, because they learned from Suger the key to running projects without disruptions.
Interesting. That is a very interesting story. And before, I mean, of course, we're already running out of time, because I try to keep this about 30 minutes. This last question I have to ask you is mainly for me. I love gardening, and you talk about a guy named Joseph Paxton, and how he's a simple gardener, and how he was able to take that simple gardening and become well off through simply gardening. So I'd like to know that story. What happened with Joseph Paxton?
Paxton lived in the 19th century, and he was coming from a very modest family. He had almost no education. He became a gardener when he was 16 years old. And he spent almost all his life as a gardener. But he made a fortune. I'm going to tell you how and why. Paxton even if he was only a gardener, he read a lot of books. He wanted to improve himself, but he had very few opportunities because in the 19th century, you were a gardener, as Paxton was. The only job was to work for one of the big one of the big parks in England from these mansions, from this aristocracy. And Paxton was working there. He became head gardener when he was 22 years old. And then he could wait until his death, 50 years later, and he wouldn't be making exactly the same salary. So he would be living in a very modest condition. So he started to think, how can I get out of this situation? And the way he did it is fascinating because he didn't know what to do, but he was very proactive, very ambitious. So he started to read newspapers, to read magazines about gardening. And eventually, by just playing with different ideas, he saw an advertisement in the newspaper about these glass constructions where they put flowers during the summer so that they can survive the winter. Glass houses. And he came with the idea, okay, maybe I could build a glass house and get a salary increase. So he ordered some materials, and in a very primitive way, he put together a glass house with some plants inside. It was very small, it was crappy, but he learned how to do it. So his employer was very impressed and said, okay, maybe you can do a bigger one. So Paxton started to build in his garden a few glass houses, put in some exotic plants, and eventually, just by sheer persistence, he got the idea that maybe he could build the glass houses in the way that plants were built. Because if you take one of these exotic plants, they have these radiating ribs, and they are actually sustaining the whole weight of the leaves of the plant with a very, very small structure. And these plants, sometimes they are huge, sometimes they are 1 meter long, these exotic leaves. And then Paxton said, maybe I could build a glass house with a very, very small weight without having to dig foundations. So he did it. He got a salary increase. And then he said, okay, what can I do now? Because I'm learning, but I'm not getting anywhere. He was very frustrated. And then eventually something happened in the around 1840. This was the Great Exhibition in London, and they wanted to put up a building for the Great Exhibition in London, and they got only 6 months to put up the building. And it has to be very inexpensive, has to be very fast, had to be dismantled after the exhibition. So all the big architectural firms, they send projects, they send the proposals, but they were all too expensive, too heavy, and too slow. And then Paxton saw the advertisement for the competition. He was very skeptical because I am only a gardener. How can I design a building? But eventually, when he read that all the proposals have been rejected because they were too expensive, they were too slow, they were too heavy, he made a drawing of a glass house, a gigantic glass house, which was 2 floors high. He presented this to the Great Exhibition Committee. He proposed to put it up in the center of London to house all the exhibitors. He presented his proposal, and he was very skeptical. He was very afraid that he would be rejected because he was only a gardener. So in order to make sure that he was not going to be excluded from the competition, he was doing something very clever, and he sent also a copy of his design to the newspapers. So the newspapers published the design because it was very weird. It was a very weird building. And then, of course, the Great Exhibition Committee could not say that they had not received the proposal because it was on all the newspapers. And eventually they gave him a chance to build this glass house. And he finished the project ahead of time, under budget. And it was a huge success. It was the most successful Great Exhibition in history. He got 18 million visitors, and people just came to see the building. And the building was called the Crystal Palace in London, actually stayed in use for 36 years instead of 6 months, because the design was so fantastic. What Paxton did is very little by little, to evolve from being a simple gardener to being a designer of glass houses, and eventually he designed buildings. This is a story typical of people who have to deal with disruptions. They are dissatisfied with their situation, and little by little they evolve into something bigger. I have a lot of examples of these situations in my book, and Paxton is a fantastic story because he was a guy with no education, very little schooling. He had no contacts in the architectural industry. He was a complete outsider, and still he became extremely wealthy and very successful.
Wow, it is a very neat story, and like you just said, there's tons of these stories in your book. We're gonna have to leave it at that. It was great having you on again, John. It's always great. That's why I always welcome you back when you have a new book out, and of course, when your next one comes out, I hope to get another invite, because it's always great talking to you. Because I love history. And most people do. They have a hard time studying it, but when they hear it, it's just so interesting to see what happened in the past. And now, not only what happened in the past, but how we can use that to our benefit today. And that's just almost without price. And again, thanks for coming on, John. Any last words before we close this up?
Just to tell your audience, when we are faced with huge problems, huge disruptions, don't give up. The human psychology is very emotional. We tend to become, we go into panic. We improvise. This is not the way to do it. Try to think on your feet. Try to be optimistic, logical. Find good examples, and then you will make it.
Awesome. Again, thanks a ton, John, for coming on the show. And the new book's called Undisrupted: How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. Check it out, and hopefully you can get yourself a copy of it and learn from history. Most importantly, put it into your daily life. All right, we'll see you next time on the Wellness Farmer Podcast.